Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hannock here with co-host Matthew Bartko and good friend Christy Al. Joining us again is our very special guest, Professor Peter Redpath, Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study of Great Ideas. As always, we begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right, and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Peter, during your last visit, we discussed the ambitious project of reuniting philosophy and science, as well as reuniting science and wisdom. Now, that leads us to 107 questions. But before we go on to any of those questions, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the second part of that ambitious project, reuniting science with wisdom. And maybe in doing so at some point, you could tell us what that might mean in terms of, and this is an interest of a great many people in the Solidarity Party, what that might mean in terms of, well, putting a human face on technology.
Oh, well, Jim, first I want to thank you for inviting me to talk again on the show, and especially on the anniversary of the death of St. Thomas Aquinas. Most fitting to get some inspiration from St. Thomas and related to this discussion. And what I wanted to do to answer that question is refer to a couple of passages from Alistair MacIntyre in After Virtue, toward the beginning of that work, where he talks about the fact that the most striking feature of contemporary moral utterance is that so much of it is used to express disagreements, and the most striking feature of these debates in which these disagreements are expressed is their interminable character. I don't mean by this that such debates go on, although they do, but also that they apparently can find no terminus. There seems to be no rational way of securing moral agreement in our culture. And then he adds, what we possess in the modern world are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess indeed simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. When I first read that, what struck me about that is that statement he made in reference to ethics could equally be made in relationship to the whole of Western theology, psychology, sociology, religion, education, politics, and Western cultural institutions in general. And that the reason that and MacIntyre is not focusing attention on this point in making his remarks. The reason we've lost this context is because the context is a real genus. And we've lost in the West the understanding of what is a real genus. All conversation in which we engage, for example, what we're doing today, occurs within the context of a genus, of some sort of organizational whole. It might be, for example, a philosophical conference, a theological conference, an ordinary conversation we're having with people. about some topic, about some subject. But we have to be talking about some sort of organizational whole that we are considering in relationship to some intellectual interest, right? Some psychological interest. So science, philosophy, has lost the understanding of science and philosophy as chiefly psychological activities, habits of the soul. The notion that philosophy, science, was a habit of the soul was crucial to the ancient Greeks. At least from this Socrates, who was the person who actually gave what's sometimes called a subjective turn, brought this personalistic element of the nature of science and philosophy into the discipline. So that's the way you reestablish the personalism within philosophy, by recognizing, and the same thing as science, by recognizing that science and philosophy is a psychological disposition. That it's not the empirically testing hypotheses. That happens to some extent within scientific reasoning in some activities, but that's not the whole of it. And philosophy, science chiefly begins with understanding what is the organization in which you now exist, the genus.
Peter, let me ask you to clarify a crucial concept for you, and no doubt for all of us, a crucial concept in what you're speaking about, the idea of an organizational whole. Now, living in the world we live in, I suspect that most of the people who hear a reference to an organizational whole are going to start to think about the bylaws and the people that make up the bylaws. And I'm using that as shorthand for some sort of a bureaucratic structure or an agenda. Now, I suppose a few people, when they hear the expression organizational whole in the context in which you're using it, few people, very few people, maybe 27, will think in terms of a form, or perhaps of a universal, or perhaps of some sort of internal dynamism. But I wish you'd say a little bit more about this concept of organizational whole.
That's a great segue, Jim, into a reference to Etienne Gilson, and I think I made reference to this in our last conversation, but where in Painting and Reality, Gilson makes this remark in a footnote, I think on page 28, that the only way, and to paraphrase him, the only way to unify a multitude is to order it. Now, I'm using the term organization instead of order. And when you read St. Thomas, he talks about the fact that it's the office of the wise man to study order. To order things, to know order, as well as to generate order. I'm using the term organization because it's I think easier for contemporaries to comprehend. But McIntyre had said that we have now the fragments of a conceptual scheme. That conceptual scheme is a genus. It's an organizational whole. right? That is composed of a multitude, and we don't have the parts. The parts no longer exist. A multitude become part of a whole by being qualified to relate to other multitudes now, as generating a common action, right? In relationship to a common aim, common end. When Gilson made that statement, it made a light go on intellectually for me. I said, "Well, gee, this is true. You know, in this world in which we live, we don't have perfect unity. At best, we have imperfect unity, which is comprised of opposites." Of a multitude that somehow or other is unified into parts of a whole. Now, how do you get a multitude, especially of talented people, to become unified into parts of a whole? Right? That's what's now not only a multitude of talented people, but with respect to one person. How does one person, for example, psychologically get the multitude of psychological parts ordered or organized in such a way as to be able to generate science or philosophical reasoning, right? Without numerically one aim, without a single act that you are seeking to generate, based upon some sort of principle of unity that is expressed in terms of harmony. The only way you can do it, the only way you can generate what Gilson's talking about, this ordered whole, is by having a principle of unity, or as you said, a form that is unequally harmonizing relationships of more or less talented people. All
right, now right here, I want to make another interjection, and I hope it's a segue as well. Very often, I'm thinking of students, and to tell you the truth, I'm also thinking of my garage. When people talk about order, I think an awful lot of people think in terms of getting everything in its place and making sure that it stays there. That'd be my idea of order for the garage. I've never been able to get everything in place yet, but isn't it so that when you're speaking of order, you're not speaking of putting everything in its place and keeping it there? You're thinking of ordering things so that there's a harmony, and the harmony is not static. We ought rather to think in terms of the harmony that we find in music, and we ought also, in terms of order, think of the various complexities and types of order. There's an order among the violins, say, and there's an order in the percussion session. And if this is an opera at some point, there's going to be order even on the part of the diva. But all of this is dynamic. It's not like the Dewey Decimal System. But in order for it to be dynamic, it has to have an internal force, not simply an external force. There can be a conductor, but if the musicians don't know how to play, it's not going to help to have the conductor leading them. And also there has to be some direction. It's not as if this order is a kind of repetitive twitch. It's something that's internally driven and leads in a direction. That is to say, it has a goal, it has a purpose. And somewhere in St. Thomas, you know how it is, it's sort of like, but even more so than, I know that in Gone with the Wind, at some point there's a discussion of such and such. Somewhere in St. Thomas, we read, prima lex caeli ordo. The first law of heaven is order. And then, of course, we have this popular view of heaven as a place where I don't really want to go because you just sit there playing on a harp. But that's utterly unlike the order that Thomas had in mind. Now, I know I've gone on a bit, but maybe you could say what I had to say and say that it's all wrong, or say that it leads to the next stage in your reflection.
Well, I very often use that example of an orchestra leader to get across the point that I try to make. And whenever I have a class of students, the first thing that I try to do is to organize them. I don't like, as you said, the term order is too restrictive. It tends to suggest not allowing for flexibility and adaptability. But St. Thomas indicates that there are two chief acts of the intellect. One is this kind of syllogistic kind of reasoning, and the other is command and control. And the chief activity of philosophy is command and control. Being able to apply principles, a knowledge of an organizational whole and what it chiefly aims to do, and then to unify, to help to unify the multitude into a harmonious relation. As I said, in general, an organization exists in the harmony of its parts. Right? That's the kind of unity that is universal to the world in which we live. It's the only kind of unity that we can establish. We can't establish perfect unity, and there's not perfect disunity. A genus for St. Thomas is a hierarchy of species, ranging from the most perfect to the least perfect. For example, the genus of medicine, which studies health. It studies most perfect, healthy bodies, most healthy and least healthy bodies, right? And it seeks to generate health and remove disease. And you could take this with respect to any kind of subject of science. What an organization that's being studied, politics, studies peace and war, for example, tries to create the most peaceful situations and remove those that are most militant. Economics, wealth and poverty. Okay, so the ancient understanding of science, as Aristotle had promoted it in St. Thomas, had adhered to it, was that a genus is an organizational whole that chiefly aims at generating one action, which in some way is always a healthy action, analogously considered with respect to that genus. And so what you have to do as a philosopher or scientist is put on a psychological cap. You want to be able to imagine what you're studying as a harmonious unity that is comprised of qualified parts. Those qualified parts being species of the organization. Right, as you said, you have people who are violinists and people who play, might be playing drums or whatever, and you are the orchestra leader exists so as to, on the one hand, modulate the activities of the different members, so that they actually become parts of a whole. Right?
Okay, now I want to have a pop question at this point, Peter, for Christy Al. I want to ask Christy, and she's got her mic off, so I hope she puts her mic back on. I want to ask Christy whether or not you could apply the general themes of what Peter's been speaking about to your view that the pro-life movement needs to get its act together. Her mic's still off. The reason why I'm asking her is because Christy has done a yeoman's service in trying to unify elements of the pro-life movement so that there really is a form, a structure, a genus, and she's recognizing that there are various elements of that movement, and she's trying to speak to all of them at the same time, serving as a kind of a volunteer conductor.
Hi, I'm on. I had 2 dogs barking and a baby screaming, so I couldn't.
That was the percussion, and there was.
Yeah. So, do you mind asking the question again? Because I have no idea what's going on.
All right. Well, I'm glad we've put the dogs on hold. Peter is talking about across the board in a typically philosophical sense, broad, about the necessity for a dynamic organization and the fact that a dynamic organization has different aspects to it, and they have to be ordered, and they have to be directed. And in this, we have the need for leadership, and we have the need for people who are understand what leaders are saying, and we have the need to submerge our merely private interests in behalf of the common good. I say to myself, well, that sounds like Christy Yao in her own inimitable fashion telling the pro-life movement, look, you guys, we got to get our act together. Now,
well, thank you. I'm flattered.
When you say, look, you guys, we got to get our act together, what are some of the dynamic structural components of your call to not arms, but your call to peace?
My call to peace. So over the baby falling asleep, I hope everyone can hear. I love the analogy of an orchestra. I think there is different places in the pro-life movement for a lot of different factions. And I think that, I was in band all throughout middle school, elementary school, high school, and it's definitely true. Like, if the trumpets are being too loud, you can't hear the flutes. And if the flutes are being too, giggly, you can't go on with the music. So definitely you have to all do your part, and you have to, a lot of one issue in particular I come up with a lot is issues of LGBT rights versus pro-life issues. And I've had to say multiple times, look, guys, people are dying. That's how serious this is. And if we can't get unified over this, you guys can go have your debates about LGBT issues another day. That's fine. You guys can have your different opinions, and that's great. But we all need to work together on this because it's serious.
And everybody says, geez, Christy, we hadn't thought of that. You're right. Or
no.
They don't say that. So you say you're gonna keep working on it. You're gonna keep working on it. All right, Peter, I just wanted to have an on-the-ground illustration of what's involved in getting our acts together. Please continue.
That was, once again, Jim, a great segue into an issue I mention often, and I think I mentioned it in our last conversation on the radio, that for decades I thought Gilson was right, Etienne Gilson was right, when he said that most philosophical mistakes start from badly framed questions, right? And that's related to McIntyre too, about the asking of questions, and the debates that are endless, right? And then I realized, look, the chief cause of endless debates is the fact that we don't know, as Aristotle said, we don't know the principle, that mistakes about first principles, right? First principles are what generate the questions, right? And if you don't know the principles that you're applying, right, that are the measures of truth, right, that you're trying to determine, then you have these interminable disputes, right? So, strictly speaking, most conversational disagreements, whether they're philosophical or not philosophical and so on, tend to start from the fact that people do not recognize the genus. And once again, when I'm talking about a genus, I'm talking about an organizational whole that is chiefly generating a multitude of parts that is chiefly generating a qualitatively distinctive kind of act. If you don't recognize the genus that you're talking about we're always talking within a genus, and we don't tend to recognize this.
And if we don't, we quarrel because we don't know how to argue.
Right. For example, if I were to ask the question, who was a better baseball player for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1956, Plato or Aristotle? It's a meaningless question. It's incoherent. It makes no sense, right? Because it's not related to the conversation. Intelligent conversations always relate to talking about some single subject, right? That from some common point of view, some common conceptualization, interest in it, and that's where you have to start the discussions in order to make progress. Now, philosophers for centuries, Thomas included, they're among the main culprits in this, have looked at philosophy as a systematic logic. Right? And they've done this chiefly because of the Enlightenment, claiming that the whole of science is contained in mathematical physics, and so what philosophers deal with is logic, and logical analysis, abstract considerations of essences, and so forth. And there's no way you're ever going to be able to reunite philosophy and science if you take that approach. That's the wrong genus. What unifies philosophical activity, scientific activity, is on the one hand the scientist, the philosopher. Philosophy science is a scientific act. It's precisely because this or that person has the talents to generate the act, a judgment of truth, of being right, habitually right, in relationship to the way this or that subject is organized and operates, that makes that subject's activities worthy of praise. To be something for which a person would be complimented, because it's the talent of the individual that is generating this. It's not the fact that you've got a bunch of facts in your head, right? And that you can will them into existence, okay? Because science is chiefly an intellectual activity. It's not simply manipulation of phenomena under the restraints of technology or being able to will this or that into existence.
Now, on this very point,
Matthew
Bartko, you are an organizer, And you are constantly and rightly reminding people in the American Solidarity Party that there are 4 coordinating key principles. And you always want to bring us back to the discussion on the basis of those 4 principles. And if we're not talking about those, we're not really talking about the American Solidarity Party. Is that not so?
Or at least not talking about it as it is. I think that there is an important distinction between people addressing the reality of an organization or of a group of people versus discussing what they wish it was like. And so I think that is also relevant when addressing a subgroup of society called scientists or philosophers, for that matter. We can talk about how we wish they were, but we can also talk about how they are. So, for example, the American Solidarity Party, I maintain, has as its core identity the support for the sanctity of human life, the necessity of social justice, our responsibility for the environment, and supporting the possibility of a more peaceful world, because that's the affirmation statement that every member has had to agree to before they joined.
Yes.
I see in, at least in modern academia, it seems like the chief goals of both philosophy and science, and I think this might be where we're going, is the ability to predict, and maybe the ideal would be if we can predict, then perhaps we can control. So to get a paper published in a scientific journal, the goal is to then be able to demonstrate your process well enough that other scientists around the world can recreate your experiment, that it has a predictive utility. It can reliably explain a phenomenon to the point where we can recreate that phenomenon consistently. Whereas I think with the philosopher, we care about that predictability, but we're also never quite content in the field of philosophy to stop asking the question why. Why is the phenomenon repeatable? Why did we care to do the experiment in the first place? And so, whereas the scientists are perhaps more concerned with the physical recreation of their experiments, the philosophers are perhaps more concerned with the metaphysics behind the experimentation. Is that a accurate framework as far as you're aware with the current way academia views itself?
Peter, back to you.
Yeah, I would say that's true. I don't think it's correct, properly understood, because philosophy is a cultural enterprise, and this replication of the application of principles is precisely the historical test that Etienne Gilson calls upon for determining whether or not philosophical claims are legitimately philosophical, whether or not when they leave the intellect of someone who's proposed them because they contain no apparent contradiction, they can actually be applied in the individual situation and circumstance to generate action. And repeatedly within the history of philosophy or Western intellectual history, Gilson finds that you have these conceptually coherent or apparently conceptually coherent notions that when you seek to put them into exercise, in other words, when they are applied to organizational activity, they, like Marxist economics, for example. Oh, okay, it's very, it's got some truths in relationship to it, abstractly considered, but in the application to the world in which we human beings live, it doesn't generate. It's not going to generate wealth, or having a certain understanding of something that's going to cure a disease. And then when you apply it in the individual situation, it has the reverse effect. And so the philosophical principles as scientific principles are generated by a cultural enterprise that enables people to stand upon the shoulders of giants, as St. Bernard of Chartres said, and to historically consider the way other intelligent people have examined specific issues, generic issues, and applied them to their own situation analogously. The reasoning of the scientist is, strictly speaking, analogy. To understand precisely what that is, you have to have a good metaphysical sense rather than try to understand it from the standpoint of, misunderstand it from the standpoint of the way logicians have done over centuries.
So if I may ask the question a little more, or ask a follow-up question a little directly, what role can those who identify as philosophers play in helping their academic brethren in the scientific community ascribe to that awareness and as I believe you would say, add wisdom to science?
Well, I think you have to get back to the understanding of science, once again, as a psychological disposition. And that that what scientists are chiefly examining is once again some sort of organizational whole, chiefly generating, being interested in generating, and how some single act is being generated by an organization. The mathematics today is in disarray. Physics today is in disarray. Theology and the reason for this is precisely because of our lack of understanding of the notions of genus and species, of real genera and real species, and how what these relate to is real organizations and the parts of the organizations, their species and their individuals, and how they generate action. Let me give you a simple example. You have a bunch of human beings who professionally are firefighters, and they go bowling. Now, as individuals, they have ordinary habits, talents, abilities, just as conversationalists and so on, to get along with one another, to be friends and so forth, to socialize. They go to the bowling alley and they can engage in mutually beneficial activity that's comprehensible to them, and while they're bowling, and then all of a sudden a fire breaks out. Right now, when they enter that bowling alley, they entered a different genus. Now they're bowlers, okay, chiefly, that fire breaks out. Now they're firefighters, okay, and they're exercising the habit of firefighting. And now that habit of firefighting only gets exercised because the fire broke out. No fire. They didn't enter a different genus. Now, human beings are constantly switching back and forth between and among different genera, and we don't realize that we're doing this. So you can't try to you can't try to solve problems of firefighting by throwing bowling balls. At fires. That's not going to work. I'm constantly asking myself, where am I? What am I doing? Precisely. In other words, you constantly have to have self-understanding. Right? The start of a human genus starts with organizational self-understanding. Precisely, who are we? Where are we going? Are we able to get there? Is this a doable deed? Is it really possible for us? That's where science starts. with the psychology of the person. Right? Am I too sick to be able to do this? Right? Am I too dumb? Is it beyond my abilities? Without a faculty psychology, in other words. The Western Enlightenment got rid of the notion of faculty psychology, got rid of the notion of the soul, with habits existing. Science exists in the habits of the soul. Get rid of the soul, you get rid of science, which is what the West has largely done.
Let me introduce a question here about terms again. You speak of psychology, and I think I'm following you. But in our contemporary context, and this is something that Alistair McIntyre spoke of very often, in our context, when people hear the word psychology, they really think therapy. And when they think therapy, they think a kind of modulation of the emotions. But when you use the word psychology, I think you're really speaking about the powers of the soul and our recognition of the powers of the soul. And I'm more used to thinking along those lines using the term of habitus, habit, but a habit that is so deep that it truly is a kind of second nature. So I wonder if, in moving ahead here, you need to say a bit more about what psychology is on your view, as opposed to how it's understood in what we might call a therapeutic culture.
Modern psychology has no soul. I mean, the classical psychology studies the human soul and the different parts of the soul, the faculties that generate human activities. Modern psychology is coming out of Rousseau and Hume, and it's based upon the notion that there are feelings that somehow or other unite. And do so in one way that either create socialization or don't generate socialization. It's based upon this fictional history, that replaces metaphysics because they can't attribute to the individual powers and abilities that generate action that make individuals responsible for what they do. You can't get away from the classical psychology, which attributes faculties, powers, abilities with which people are born and that are pre-birth within human beings in order to understand human behavior.
Okay, now, how are we going to act in such a way as to recenter psychology, act in such a way, whether it's in the American Solidarity Party or in a philosophical association or within a group of community organizers? How are we going to act in such a way as to affect the kinds of changes which amount to a recentering that you're speaking of?
The way I've chosen to do it, I know that there are people who have been interested in restoring classical education and so forth, in many ways through different institutions. I've worked with that with respect to homeschooling and great books education, but on the level of higher education. What we don't need are more universities, more colleges. What we need is a proper understanding of the teachings of St. Thomas more than anything else. His organizational psychology, what actually were the principles that he was using that made him into an organizational genius? One of the things I've noticed about people who have studied not only St. Thomas but Plato and Aristotle, over the centuries and have really immersed themselves in it, in those subjects, is that they tend to be organizational geniuses, and this is one of the reasons why this topic became so interesting to me. Whether I was thinking of Ralph McInerney or Etienne Gilson or Maritain or Mortimer Adler or Joseph Owens, someone like a John Anton, or even somebody like Quentin Lauer, who was my Hegel teacher they had an understanding of the classical conception, the classical psychology, right? That enabled thinkers to order and organize their own activity based upon intellectual and moral virtues. That human education, what you need is a bunch of students, not a university. You need a bunch of students organized around a new understanding of the psychology that underlies the scientific understanding of Aquinas. You referred to to leadership before, right? Now, for St. Thomas, good, better, and best only exist within a genus. We can only make comparisons of good, better, and best, more or less perfect within a genus. And leadership only occurs within a genus. The starting point for the development of an organization, right, for some sort of leadership relationship, is the formation of an organizational whole, so that the people sense belonging to the same organization. This is what a leader does.
Okay, now let me because we don't have much time left, and this always happens to us. Let me throw a brick in the bouillabaisse. Once upon a time, Jacques Maritain, I think he might have had a third glass of wine when he said this. Who knows? I certainly don't. Said that there are really only three radicals on the public scene. And one of these radicals was Eduardo Frei, who was the chief figure in government in Chile, and who was a professed Christian Democrat, and had all sorts of really important and illuminating political analyses that he acted on. And he became, I wish I had my terms better here, for want of a better term, I'll say the president or the premier of Chile, and for a time was very successful. And we had something comparable, really, with Rafael Caldera in Venezuela. So that was one of the three individuals that Maritain pointed to. And he pointed to himself. Who of us is perfect enough to be perfectly humble? And now I hope that Christy Yao hasn't been dragged away by her dogs, or isn't off doing really truly important work like changing a nappy. And then he pointed to Saul Alinsky. And Alinsky, in a certain sense, also was an organizational genius. Frei organizing a state. At that time, Alinsky organizing Back of the Yards, and then what came from that, Reveille for Radicals, and on and on and on. Fiercely controversial, as was Frei, because he wound up being ultimately ousted by a group that led to Allende and communist penetration in Chile. And, of course, Maritain himself was sharply criticized by any number of thinkers, and on more than one occasion by the more historically rooted Etienne Gilson. So, what am I saying here? For the American Solidarity Party and the Alinsky wing of the party, people who say we ought to join this demonstration and that demonstration, is there a way to get past demonstrations canceling each other out and do something creative and constructive on the streets that will lead people to say, well, I guess this is sort of like a demonstration, but if we're going to have the genus of public performance politics, hot damn, this is the best we've seen. Are you there, Christy? How are you there, or have you fled? She may have fled.
If you don't mind me saying so, Jim, I think what you're talking about is a movement I'm quite proud of, in that some of our local chapters are taking to doing, as opposed to just protests or meetups, they're also doing public service. They're going and working in community gardens. They're going and helping out where various projects need to be done. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that we are, in fact, a 527 as far as the IRS is concerned, and that means that we are a political organization, which means that we also have to get people out there not just protesting, but also petitioning, gathering signatures, running for office, taking the reins of political power to actually affect change, not just on Main Street, but in the Capitol building as well.
Do you think Peter Redpath could be doing that in Arizona?
I think anyone willing to strap on their tennis shoes and knock on their neighbors' doors has a chance.
Listen, Peter, our colleague Mario Ramos Reyes is doing that in Kansas. So, I mean, if he can do it in Kansas, well, I bet it could be done in Arizona.
Well, Mario is an exceptional individual, exceptionally talented person, talking about people that know Latin American politics and being able to benefit from personal experience. He's certainly exceptional. And I've been in the political fray for decades.
But you're not frayed by that fray.
No, but
you're still full of P and V. But
the point is, I think, a good one in relationship to the fact that you can't look to academics and academia and the decaying intellectual institutions of the West to lead the revolution, the Cultural Revolution. As Curtis Hancock says, that's like looking to incendiaries to help you put out a forest fire. You have to develop a public philosophy, just like the Renaissance humanists developed academies. The philosophy can only develop within institutions of higher learning to the extent that it's in some way present within the popular culture through literary works, through the activities of people like Marcel and just developing alternative groups in which serious philosophical reasoning is actually being done, and it's not being held hostage to the politically correct restrictions and restraints that are put on in formal academia, and as well as just a lack of understanding, of the way in which new organizations are generated. You have to step out of the old ones and start to recognize the situation in which you exist. This takes the type of reasoning which St. Thomas locates in the cogitative reason, right? And in the exercise of prudential judgment. Leaders exist within organizations. Leadership only exists within organizations, and it only exists within those people possessed of the virtues, the excellences related to those organizations. You get rid of the notion of purpose, aims, talents, and so forth, you have no principles of leadership. This is the Enlightenment. This is modern Europe, Western Europe, the United States to a large extent. The leaders in pretty much all organizations, what McIntyre is complaining about, they've lost the context in which they reason properly, because they don't recognize that they're always reasoning within some sort of organizational whole, and they're not rightly identifying what that is and where they are located within it and what kind of contribution they can make to it.
Well, I can't help but think of, especially as we come close to the end of the hour, of someone who is more than a leader, much more than a leader, although he came to an end comparable to that of Socrates, who warned us about putting new wine in old wineskins. What happens is the wineskins burst and everything is lost. And then I can't help but thinking of Jacques Maritain, who emphasized and spoke and wrote a book with the title The Primacy of the Spiritual. And I can't help but think of his mentor, who was not, in fact, a Roman Catholic, but who led, oddly enough, a Roman Catholic revival, Charles Péguy, who said the revolution will be moral, and we might say will be intelligent, purpose-oriented, and use means ordered to the end in view. The revolution will be moral, or it will not be at all.
That's a very good point, Jim, because at the foundation of all human organizations is a moral culture, even though some people might deny it. And the reason for that, Plato recognized it in Book 1 of the Republic, where he talks about the fact that even a band of thieves, if they want to be effective as thieves, have to practice justice toward each other when they're robbing somebody else. And there has to be some sort of prudential judgment also being made to understand when to apply this or that activity in the individual circumstance. So all new organizations grow out of a moral culture, and that moral culture has to be based on the cardinal moral virtues, especially the application of prudence and justice, which apply temperance and courage toward other people to create social activity, harmonious activity. There has to be a cult. That's why I said a public philosophy is necessary to reform the current situation with these decaying institutions, because you have to develop a new cultural enterprise, much like Alcuin, and what Charlemagne was doing decades ago, centuries ago. The cultural revival has to start. Maritain saw this within these small groups of individuals who are in some way classically educated, and educated in relationship to understanding the nature of the human person.
Yes, we have that, and we have the gospel. We have God's word. And let me close. We just have 2 minutes left. Let me close with part of the epistle from Friday's liturgy. I say epistle. We call them now readings, right? It's taken from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Lo, on your fast day, you carry out your own pursuits and drive all your laborers. Yes, your fast ends in quarreling and fighting, striking with a wicked claw. Would that today you might fast so as to make your voice heard on high. Is this the manner of fasting I wish, of keeping a day of penance, that a man bow his head like a reed and lie in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? This rather is the fasting that I wish, releasing those bound unjustly, untying the thongs of the yoke, setting free the oppressed, breaking every yoke, sharing your bread with the hungry, sheltering the oppressed and the homeless, clothing the naked when you see them, and not turning your back on your own. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your wound shall quickly be healed. Your vindication shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. Thank you all. We'll be in touch in our usual way. I want to especially thank Peter for being our very welcome guest today. Godspeed.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.